All right, let's get started with another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something really big, global constitutional reform trends in 2023. You want to understand like the big picture of how constitutions all over the world are being well reshaped is the word I'm going to use.
Yeah.
And you've sent me over a ton of reports, which they're pretty fascinating.
It's so interesting, to think about constitutions as living documents. They're always evolving to reflect a nation's values and
Yeah.
how it decides to govern itself. And 2023 was a really big year for shifts. We've got everything from formal amendments to landmark court rulings and even some really shooted public debates.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really stood out to me was the seems like the growing influence of the courts in shaping constitutional issues. Seems like in a lot of countries the judiciary is, stepping up and saying, we've got something to say about this too.
Exactly. This trend is often called the judicialization of politics, and is particularly noticeable in Brazil. Imagine a system where citizens can directly petition the Supreme Court on constitutional matters. So many crucial political decisions are being shaped by legal rulings, and sometimes that even bypasses traditional legislative processes.
Wow, that's a lot of power in the hands of the courts. And we see it playing out in some pretty high-stakes scenarios. Like the report on Colombia mentions the case where the Supreme Court actually rejected a major mining contract because the government hadn't been transparent enough in the deal.
Yeah, that case really exemplifies how courts are, acting as a check on executive power, making sure that governments also have to play by the rules. But it is a delicate balancing act, though. It sparks a lot of debate about how much influence the judiciary should, wield in a democracy.
For sure. Speaking of checks and balances, another area where we see action is in electoral systems. Several countries are facing serious questions about how they conduct elections, and this has some pretty big consequences.
Yeah, absolutely. Croatia is a good example of how demographic shifts can force a country to reevaluate its electoral map. The Constitutional Court there made a ruling declaring existing electoral districts unconstitutional because they didn't accurately reflect population distribution anymore. It was a powerful statement about making sure every vote carries equal weight, which is like a core principle of democratic representation.
Yeah, and meanwhile, over in Ecuador, they went the referendum route. And things went in a completely different direction. The people actually voted against proposed amendments that would change how their National Assembly was made up and would have impacted other key aspects of their electoral system. It seems like a win for those who were worried about those changes concentrating power in the wrong hands.
You're exactly right. It highlights how much people care about safeguarding their democratic processes and preventing anyone from getting too much power. Constitutional reforms often become a battleground for competing interests. Different groups try to shape the rules of the game to their advantage.
It's a high-stakes game, and we can't ignore the debates about individual rights and freedoms that are happening on the constitutional stage.
Oh, for sure. The case of same-sex marriage in Greece is a good illustration of how social values clash with legal frameworks. Their constitution doesn't explicitly say no to same-sex marriage. This has led to some legal arguments based on human dignity and equality before the law, but of course it's run into opposition from traditional groups. The church is a vocal opponent.
Yeah, it's a classic example of, how societies evolve and how legal systems sometimes struggle to catch up. That tension between evolving social values and established legal norms is playing out really dramatically in the U.S. right now, especially with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. That single decision reignited the entire abortion rights debate and has people asking some fundamental questions about how hard it should be to amend the Constitution, especially when you think about the Equal Rights Amendment. Long and kind of controversial journey to potential ratification.
The U.S. system, with its supermajority requirements and complex amendment process, really highlights how difficult constitutional change can be. It's designed to be deliberate and carefully thought out, but that also means it can be slow to adapt to new realities or shifts in social tides.
Right, some countries make it really hard to tinker with their constitutions, and then you have cases like Chile, where they've been on a bit of a constitutional roller coaster. They actually had 2 tries at drafting a brand new constitution, and both failed. It led to this weird period. It was called constitutional silence, where they were basically operating without a fully agreed upon set of fundamental laws. It really makes you think about how essential a stable constitutional framework is, even though it needs to be able to change over time.
Yeah, Chile's experience shows that constitutional reform isn't just about what changes, but also about the process. Finding that balance between inclusivity, representation, and actually getting things done, it can be really hard.
And even when they did decide on some reforms, Chile took a pretty multi-pronged approach. They brought back compulsory voting, which is a really interesting idea.
Yeah.
And they also made some changes to those supermajority requirements for passing certain laws. It's like fine-tuning their democracy in real time.
Yeah, and that's a key takeaway here. There's no one-size-fits-all model for constitutional change.
Hmm.
Every country has its own context, its own history, its own political dynamics that shapes how these reforms play out.
Right. But we also have to talk about how not all constitutional reforms were created equal. We have to mention Hungary. Their recent amendments have been, well, they've been making some people internationally concerned.
Yeah, the concerns around Hungary are about how these changes have been made. There's not a lot of transparency. There's not a lot of public debate. And there's this feeling that these amendments are mainly about, serving narrow political interests. Instead of reflecting a broader agreement, a lot of people are worried about the weakening of democratic norms and the possibility of a small group getting more power.
Yeah, and a perfect example is that whole digital identifier thing they're pushing. It's supposed to make government services easier. But some people argue that it could also be used to compromise data privacy and give the government too much control over people's information. It's that classic slippery slope argument. It makes me a little uneasy.
That's understandable. It's a classic problem. How much power should we, as citizens, give to the government in exchange for efficiency or security? And what can we do to stop that power from being misused? These are questions every society thinks about. And constitutional reforms are where these questions are fought over.
Yeah. And those questions get even harder when you think about a country like Ukraine, where they're trying to figure out constitutional reform while there's a war going on. I mean, how do you even start thinking about long-term ways of governing when your country's survival is at stake?
It really makes you think about what a constitution should be. Is it just a set of rules for when things are peaceful? Or does it give us a way to deal with the worst possible situations? A foundation for upholding our values even in the middle of chaos and uncertainty. Yeah, it really does make you think about that.
It really does. It makes you realize that even in countries that aren't facing existential threats like war, these debates about changing constitutions, they're really about something much bigger, right? It's about figuring out what kind of society we want to live in and how we balance individual rights with what the group as a whole needs.
Exactly. It's about power. It's about values. Ultimately, the future we're building for ourselves and future generations. We talked about the growing power of courts, the scrutiny of how elections work, and the clash between what society believes and the laws we have. But with all these examples from around the world, I'm curious what has really stuck with you. What from these reports has grabbed your attention?
Honestly, the situation in Greece with the same-sex marriage debate, that really stands out. It's just such a good illustration of how constitutional interpretation can change and be open to new social and legal arguments. The fact that their constitution doesn't say no to same-sex marriage has opened the door to this really interesting legal battle. It's really pushing the boundaries of how we traditionally interpret things.
It's a perfect example of how these legal issues, which can seem kind of abstract, actually have a huge impact on real people's lives. Behind every debate about a constitution, there are people and communities whose rights and futures are on the line.
Absolutely. And it's not just about individual rights either, like that case in Colombia, where the Supreme Court rejected that mining contract. It shows how constitutional principles can have a real effect on economic policy.
And protecting the environment. These aren't just theories that can shape a whole country. Exactly. And that case really shows the interplay between different parts of the government. The Supreme Court in Colombia basically acted as a check on the president's power, protecting the interests of the communities and the environment. It makes you wonder what long-term effects that decision will have both inside Colombia and in how other countries see the role of the courts in these kinds of situations.
This is a big game of constitutional dominoes. Every move can set off a chain reaction.
That's a great way to put it. It's what makes this so interesting to study and watch, this dance between different branches of government, between individual rights and what society needs, between adapting to change and keeping our core values. It's always moving. And ultimately, it shows how humans are always trying to create fair and effective systems of government.
Yeah, well said. One thing that keeps coming up is this tension between changing the Constitution and what some people might call tearing it apart. On the one hand, constitutions need to be flexible. They have to change as society's needs and values change. But we also have to be careful about changes that could undermine the very basics of democracy and the rule of law.
It's a delicate balance, and as we've seen from these examples, there's no simple answer for doing it right. What works in one country could be terrible in another, even within the same country. Changing the Constitution can be full of surprises.
It reminds us that these are living documents, shaped by different forces pulling in different directions, and they're always being interpreted and reinterpreted. And that brings us back to Hungary, their way of reforming their constitution. It's definitely sparked concerns about them maybe overreaching and weakening those checks and balances we were just talking about.
Right, the worries about Hungary come from a feeling that there isn't a real public discussion happening, and that these changes are being pushed through for a specific reason, instead of coming from a broader agreement within the country. The whole digital identifier thing is a good example. While it's presented as a way to make things easier, it sparked feels about data privacy and possible government surveillance.
It all comes down to trust.
Right.
How much are we willing to trust the people in power, and what's stopping them from misusing that power? The digital identifier is like a perfect illustration of this problem. It's convenient and efficient. But what does it mean for individual freedoms?
That's the big question that societies all around the world are dealing with as technology gets better. And the way governments work changes. We need to be even more careful about protecting basic rights and making sure that any changes to our constitutions make democracy stronger, not weaker.
It's a conversation that needs to be happening everywhere, not just in countries where they're already changing things. We need to be thinking about these things ahead of time, expecting problems, and having open and informed discussions about the kind of future we want.
That's a really important point. Constitutional reform isn't just about reacting to what's happening now. It's about shaping our societies for generations to come. We can't just sit back and watch. We all have a responsibility to make sure our constitutions reflect our shared values and hopes for the future.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. For the details of how amendments work, to the balance between individual rights and what society needs. We've even talked about how hard it is to change a constitution during a war. But is there one example that stands out to you, one that really captures the trends we've been talking about?
You know, the case of Chile is really interesting. They tried twice to create a whole new constitution, and both times it didn't work. Then they had this period of constitutional silence. It really shows how hard it is to change a constitution. In the end, they decided to focus on specific changes instead of big, sweeping ones. And that decision itself tells you a lot about how you have to balance being ambitious with being practical.
It's like they went through this constitutional trial by fire and came out of it understanding how fragile and resilient these documents are. Their experience is a good lesson for any country thinking about changing their constitution. It reminds us that there's no one right way to do it, and that the process itself is just as important as the result.
Exactly. Chile's story shows how important it is to think carefully, build consensus, and be willing to adapt to unexpected problems. These aren't just abstract ideas. They're key to making changes to a constitution that last and truly serve the needs of a nation.
It really makes you think. We can't take these processes for granted. Constitutions are the foundation of our societies. They're the framework for our rights, our freedoms, and how we govern ourselves. We have a responsibility to engage with these issues, to understand the details, and to be a part of shaping the future we want.
Well said. Constitutional reform isn't just a legal thing. It shows who we are as people, and it shapes the future of our countries.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. Thanks for helping us understand these complex and fascinating trends.
It was my pleasure. The more we understand these things, the better we can have meaningful conversations and make sure our constitutions truly represent our values and what we want.
So for those of you listening, what are you taking away from this deep dive? What questions do you have? Which country's experience really stood out to you? We've just scratched the surface here, so keep exploring the topics that have piqued your interest.
And remember, this isn't just about countries far away or complicated legal stuff. These trends affect all of us. So stay informed, stay involved, and keep thinking critically.
As we wrap up this deep dive into global constitutional reform trends, I keep finding myself thinking about the human side of it. It's easy to get caught up in the legal details and the political stuff. But in the end, these changes really affect people's lives.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's important to remember that constitutions aren't just some documents. They're the framework for how we live, how we interact with each other, and what rights and freedoms we have. The cases we've talked about today really show this.
Like the debate about same-sex marriage in Greece. It's not just some theoretical discussion. It's about real couples who are fighting for recognition and equality, their struggle to have their relationships recognized and protected. It shows how powerful it is when we interpret the Constitution in a way that affects people's lives.
Yeah, and in Colombia, the Supreme Court's decision on that mining contract, it wasn't just about legal ideas. It actually affected the lives of people in those communities, and it affected the country's environmental future. It reminds us that these principles in the Constitution, they can have big consequences that go way beyond the courtroom.
It really shows how connected all these issues are. Constitutional reform isn't just about legal stuff. It's about shaping a country's social, economic, and environmental landscape. And it's about making sure those changes reflect what the people want.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for people to be involved in these discussions, to understand what these changes could mean, and to speak up. We saw a great example of this in Ecuador, where the people made their voices heard in that referendum. They rejected those proposed changes that they felt would hurt their democracy.
Yeah, it was a win for the people who believe that. Constitutions are only legitimate if the people agree to them. It shows that even when things get really complicated with legal and political stuff, the people can still win.
Ecuador's experience shows how important it is to be an active citizen, to be informed, to talk to each other, and to take part in the processes that shape our societies. It also highlights how important things like referendums are. They give people a direct say in these matters.
And then we have Ukraine, where trying to change the Constitution takes on a whole new meaning. Because they're at war. Their situation makes us think about the very purpose of a constitution. Can it guide a nation not just in governing, but also in surviving its most dangerous times?
Ukraine's journey reminds us that trying to create a fair and effective system of government doesn't happen in a bubble. Things outside a country, like war, economic problems, and global power shifts, can really affect how constitutional reform happens. How Ukraine deals with these challenges will probably have a long-lasting impact, not just on their own country, but also on how other countries might approach constitutional reform during a crisis.
It's a reminder that building and refining a system of government is never really over. It takes constant attention, adaptation, and a willingness to face unexpected problems. And it shows how interconnected countries are today. What one country goes through can teach others valuable lessons.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's good to come back to the main things we've talked about. We've seen courts getting more power, electoral systems being closely examined, and the ongoing struggle to balance changing social values with the laws we already have. And through all of this, we keep seeing this tension between the need for constitutions to change with the times and the need to protect them from changes that could undermine democracy and the rule of law.
It's a tough balance. And as we've seen, there's no one right answer. What works great in one place might fail in another. Even in the same country, constitutional reform could be full of surprises.
But I think what connects all these cases, even though they're different, is this shared goal of trying to create a better system of government, one that's fairer, more equal, and more effective. Whether it's couples fighting for the right to marry in Greece, citizens protecting their elections in Ecuador, or a country trying to figure out how to govern itself during a war, there's this common thread of trying to make a system that reflects what the people want.
And that, I think, is the most encouraging thing we can take away from this. Even with all the complications and challenges, people always want to improve how they're governed. They want to make things better, however they define that.
And for those of you listening, we hope this deep dive has not only given you information, but has also encouraged you to keep thinking about these important questions. Remember, constitutions aren't just static documents. They're living, breathing representations of who we are as societies. And by understanding how they work, by talking to each other, and by taking part in shaping our constitutions, we can all work together to create a more just and equal world.
So stay curious, stay involved, and keep those deep dives going. Until next time,